War in the Pacific begins. The day the world changed on December 7th, 1941. The United States woke to the sound of exploding battleships. Pearl Harbor was on fire. By mid-morning, the Pacific Fleet lay shattered in the harbor, smoke rising into the sky like black pillars. To Americans, it seemed as if this was the beginning of war in the Pacific. But Pearl Harbor was only the match. The firestorm had already been prepared. Long before the first Zero fighter crossed Oahu, Japanese soldiers were climbing into landing craft in Southeast Asia. Bombers were warming engines in Taiwan. Submarine fleets were moving into Philippine waters. The Japanese Imperial headquarters had spent months preparing what would become one of the largest coordinated offensives in military history, a shockwave across an ocean. The beginning of the Pacific War was not Pearl Harbor alone. It was a continent-wide collapse, a lightning empire grab, a total reordering of Asia. This is the true story of how the Pacific War began, across Malaya, Hong Kong, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and the vast blue waters of the Pacific, a story of rapid Japanese conquests, Allied defeats, and a global war that would reshape the 20th century. Japan's imperial ambition, a rising empire with a fatal weakness. At the dawn of the 20th century, Japan transformed itself from an isolated island nation to a modern industrial empire. Victories in the Russo-Japanese War, the annexation of Korea, and expansion into Manchuria gave Japan enormous confidence. But Japan's empire had a fatal flaw. It lacked the natural resources to sustain itself. Japan needed oil to fuel ships and aircraft rubber for tires and machinery, tin and iron for industry grain and rice for its population. In short, Japan needed what Southeast Asia possessed and what the Western colonial powers controlled. The war in China since 1937, Japan had fought a brutal war in China, capturing major cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Wuhan, and Canton. But by 1940, the war had bogged down into a bloody stalemate. China refused to surrender. To break China economically, Japan seized French Indochina in mid-1941, cutting China's last supply routes. This move pushed the United States past its breaking point. The oil embargo, Japan's deadline. When Japan moved into Indochina, the US responded by freezing Japanese assets and cutting off the supply of oil. Japan had oil reserves for about 18 months of normal use or 6 months of wartime operations. Without oil, Japan's navy, the heart of its empire, would die. Japan had 3 choices: withdraw from China and accept humiliation, fight the US and Britain to seize Southeast Asian resources, negotiate, but Tokyo believed Washington would not allow a Japanese empire. Japan chose war. Yamamoto's strategic logic Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, understood the danger of war with America. He warned, "For 6 months I will run wild. After that I can guarantee nothing." Yamamoto knew Japan had only one chance: strike everywhere at once. Shock the world, destroy American power in the Pacific, capture resources before the US could mobilize. This was the birth of Japan's Pacific Blitzkrieg. The attacks begin Pearl Harbor as the signal. The moment Pearl Harbor was hit, at 7:48 a.m. Hawaiian time, Japanese commanders across Asia received the coded message, "Climb Mount Nitaka." This meant, begin operations. Malaya, Japan's first landing hours before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops landed at Kota Baru, Malaya, attacking British forces under darkness and monsoon rain. The British expected Japan to attack from the sea. Japan instead used bicycle infantry light tanks jungle warfare specialists. The British were outmaneuvered repeatedly. Malaya became a disaster zone for Allied forces. Hong Kong under siege. On December 8th, Japanese armies crossed from mainland China into the British colony of Hong Kong. Despite brave resistance from British, Indian, and Canadian troops, they were overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day, 1941. The Philippines under fire General Douglas MacArthur commanded U.S. and Filipino forces in the Philippines. Hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers destroyed American aircraft at Clark Field, wiping out much of U.S. air power in one attack. Within days, Japanese troops were landing across Luzon. MacArthur retreated toward the Bataan Peninsula, preparing for a final stand. Guam and Wake Island. Guam Falls, Guam, defended by a tiny garrison, fell almost immediately. It was the first American territory to be captured. Wake Island, the unexpected fight. Wake Island, however, became a symbol of American courage. On December 11th, the first Japanese landing attempt was repulsed, the only time in history a Japanese invasion fleet was turned back in the early Pacific War. But Japan returned with overwhelming force. Wake Island fell on December 23rd, after 2 weeks of bombardment. The collapse of British power in Asia, loss of the Prince of Wales and Repulse Britain sent 2 of its most powerful ships, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, to Singapore to deter Japan. They sailed without air cover. Japan attacked with torpedo bombers. Both ships sank within hours. This marked a historic moment, the end of the battleship era and the rise of air power. The road to Singapore, Japanese forces advanced south through Malaya at astonishing speed. British commanders believed the jungle was impassable. Japanese soldiers proved them wrong, using jungle paths and bicycles to encircle British lines. By early February, Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, was surrounded. The surrender of Singapore. On February 15, 1942, Singapore surrendered. It was one of the largest capitulations in British military history. Churchill later said, "It was the worst disaster ever to befall British arms." The Philippines and the fall of Bataan MacArthur's defense. As Japanese forces tightened their grip, American and Filipino troops fought doggedly across Bataan and Corregidor. They faced starvation, malaria, dysentery, dwindling ammunition. Still, they held out for months. Shall return. Ordered to evacuate to Australia by Roosevelt, MacArthur left the Philippines reluctantly. Before leaving, he made his famous promise, "I shall return." The surrender of Bataan. By April 1942, defenders could no longer fight. On April 9th, Bataan fell. This led to one of the most horrific events of the war. The Bataan Death March. After the surrender, 76,000 American and Filipino troops were marched over 100 kilometers. Japanese guards beat prisoners, denied water, bayoneted the wounded, executed escape attempts. Thousands died on the roadside. The Bataan Death March became a symbol of Japanese wartime brutality and strengthened American resolve. Japan takes the Dutch East Indies, the battle for oil. Japan's greatest objective was the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. To reach them, Japan launched invasions of Borneo, Celebes, Java, Sumatra, the Abda fleet's failure. The Allies formed the Abda Command, American, British, Dutch, and Australian forces, to stop Japan. But they faced poor communication, outdated ships, lack of coordination, superior Japanese tactics. At the Battle of the Java Sea, Japan sank or disabled nearly the entire ABDA fleet. Japan gains the oil. By March 1942, Japan had seized 70% of the world's natural rubber massive oil reserves, strategic ports throughout Southeast Asia. Japan was now at the height of its power. Japan's expanding empire. By early 1942, Japan controlled territory from Burma, Malaya, Singapore, Philippines, Hong Kong, Indochina, Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, Solomon Islands. The Western colonial presence in Asia had collapsed in months. Japanese propaganda declared Asia for Asians. But in reality, Japan imposed harsh military rule across its new empire. The dangers of overextension. Japan's victories were fast, too fast. Industrial weakness. Japan could not match the US. Steel production, aircraft manufacturing, shipbuilding, pilot training. Pilot losses. Japan's pilots were elite, but irreplaceable. Every lost Zero pilot weakened Japan permanently. A frontier too large, Japan now had to defend. Thousands of islands, thousands of miles of coastline, multiple naval routes, dozens of airfields. It was impossible. US code-breaking American codebreakers began reading Japanese communications. This would lead directly to the coming turning point at Midway. The first American counter-strikes the Doolittle Raid. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25, bombers launched from the USS Hornet and bombed Tokyo. The physical damage was small. The psychological impact was enormous. Japan was shocked. They realized the US could strike the home islands. The Battle of the Coral Sea. In May 1942, the US and Japan fought the world's first naval battle in which ships never saw each other. Everything happened by aircraft. The Allies suffered losses, but Japan's advance toward Australia was stopped. This set the stage for the decisive clash to come. The world before Midway by June 1942. Japan had conquered more territory in 6 months than Germany had in 2 years. America had suffered its worst defeats since the Civil War. Britain had lost its Asian empire. The Philippines had fallen. The Pacific seemed lost. Japan believed it was invincible. Tokyo planned to destroy the remaining American carriers at a tiny island called Midway. But Japan did not know the US had cracked its naval codes. Japan did not know American carriers were waiting. Japan did not know its 6-month window was closing. The Pacific War had begun in fire and triumph for Japan. But the tide was about to turn.